In the play that we put on at Spiritual Renewal Week a couple of weeks ago called Meeting the Masters, and that we also performed here and in Sacramento, it's the story of several of Master's notable disciples and their first meeting with Yogananda, the blessings they received from him, and also, although the theme was not always apparent, a moment when they did not follow the Guru's guidance, and as a consequence suffered the remorse that a true disciple would feel in not having the strength to go forward. It was actually a very interesting and actually quite creative thought to put all of those together. The excitement of finding the spiritual path, the first experience of being uplifted by that relationship, and then the inevitable moment when, no matter how sincere your desire and how deep your longing, somehow you slip a little bit from that attunement. And much could be written about that in the lives of all of those great souls, but the demands of theatrical performance reduced it down to just 15 or 20 minutes of each story. But still, each disciple had a moment where something was asked of them, but they, either by fear or misunderstanding, didn't receive the message in the right way and went in the wrong direction. But of course, obviously, because of their spiritual greatness, you could see that sooner or later they turned themselves around. In the life of Christ, at the Last Supper, we have that incredibly poignant interplay between Peter and Jesus. When Peter is warning when Jesus is warning the disciples that he's about to die, even though they didn't really hear that clearly until a few hours later when the drama began to act itself out. But he's telling them, Jesus is telling his closest disciples in this most intimate of settings, that I'm going somewhere where you can't follow. And Peter, apparently having a rather blustery temperament, disputes what Jesus says. And instead of listening sensitively to try to feel what the Guru is telling him, he just asserts his own energy. I've been reviewing my own life in the process of writing a book about all my years with Swamiji, and I regret to say Peter's action was all too familiar to me. I can't say that I denied Christ as Peter did, but instead of listening sensitively to assert one's own understanding, was all too common a fault of my own, much to my own dismay. What would Swamiji have said if I had let him finish? You know, it's an unanswerable question at this point. And in the story of the life of Jesus and Peter, Jesus says to Peter, I'm going where you can't go. And Peter says, I'll follow you anywhere, with a great deal of energy and enthusiasm, which was to his credit. Almost always, lamentably, our faults are our virtues taken just a little too far. Peter was enthusiastic and determined, and in that enthusiasm and determination, he pushed too far and wasn't able to listen. So Jesus says to him, oh, really? In so many words, really? And then he makes that announcement that 3 times before the dawn comes, before the cock crows and announces the dawn, you will say that you don't even know me. Now that was a conversation stopper, I'm sure, in the context. I mean, you have to realize that these are all real people. Here's Peter, who's the acknowledged leader of their band of disciples, asserting what all the other disciples would cheer and envy. There's no place you're not going to go that I'm not going to go with you. And instead, Jesus tells him, in fact, you're going to fail miserably and very soon. Quite a moment in time. And it is no small credit to Peter and an enormous example of discipleship that, in fact, blinded by fear and confusion when Jesus was arrested and taken away and then subjected to so much humiliation and torture, that Peter panicked. All the disciples panicked. At least Peter was closer to Jesus. Many of the rest of them just ran away. Here's this armed cohort coming to arrest them with the power to imprison them and torture them and kill them. I mean, how many disciples would just cling to Jesus' arm and say, if you take him, you take me? We'd like to think that we would. But you never know in the moment. And in the moment, Peter followed Jesus, but when confronted 3 times, aren't you one of his followers? Didn't I see you with him? No. Peter said, no. And it wasn't until the 3rd denial that he heard the sound of the rooster, and all of a sudden it all came back to him. Now, Peter actually had a very serious choice at that point. You know, he could have decided, as many disciples decide, many devotees decide over and over again in their incarnations, oh well, I'm too humiliated, I'm too mortified. Here he had been exposed in front of all his brothers, and then it had in fact been fulfilled. He'd done exactly the awful thing that Jesus said he would do, despite his own self-image. You see, his self-image was one of absolute unshakable courage. But in fact, when pressed, he became terrified. Now, the test, you think, is the courage to stand by Jesus in such a moment. And yes, that would have been nice. But I'm sure the real test, the one he had to really face, is what did he do after he failed? Because that's the more realistic point at which we're all going to find ourselves. You know, no matter how we assert our determination, we are bound by our own karma. We're caught by the rust on the mirror, by the smoke obscuring the fire. We don't know. It's impossible for us to know all the forces that are playing against us. With our conscious mind, we draw a self-image that pleases us and is not untrue, but it's limited, almost by definition. Until we're self-realized, we really don't know what kind of karmic forces are lurking. By the grace of God, we forget, don't we, from incarnation to incarnation. We can feel certain impulses within us, but we don't have a clear memory. We barely remember this lifetime. Isn't it so? We barely remember influences from childhood or terribly embarrassing moments that we try very hard to forget. There's even a trick of memory, which one time I was actually drawn into it. I think God was teaching me. As you all know, we went through years of depositions in court in which the opponents of Ananda were saying outrageously impossible, absolutely untrue things about everything, about Ananda. And I often wondered to myself, do they know that they're lying? Do they sit up at night and think of a story to tell? But I was told that memory plays a trick sometimes. If you're in a situation in which you have behaved less than optimally, oftentimes, and this is a verified fact, you will switch roles. And somebody else will have behaved badly and you'll have behaved fine. This is how the subconscious mind works. I thought it was preposterous. But I was telling, right in the middle of that period, I was telling a story once, and it wasn't even about making me look better. But I started telling the story, and suddenly I realized I had reversed the roles. And I know God gave that to me, just so that I would see. Memory is a very unreliable friend, companion, and it's always playing with us because reason follows feeling. And so what we do after we fail is a much greater indicator of how we're going to fare spiritually than whether or not we fail. So what did Peter do? Well, Peter persevered. Here he is, and who knows what bitter tears he shed. Who knows what went on in his heart. But he did not give up his spiritual life. And he was there with the other disciples, gathered together in the locked room after Jesus had died. Swamiji always, points, just a moment. Swamiji always points to the fact that the disciples were gathered together as a very serious and important indicator of them having the right consciousness. Here their leader had been arrested and to their, as far as they knew, killed, because the resurrection had not come yet. As far as they knew, he'd been killed. But instead of taking that opportunity to run away, they sought out each other. You see, which was a sign of the fact that they still believed. They still believed in what they had experienced. So in order to face this very difficult challenge of Jesus being crucified, they looked to each other. And so they were gathered together in fear with the door locked. That's how the story is told, because if Jesus had been arrested, who knows who else would be arrested? If Jesus had been killed, who knew? Who else was also going to be killed? So they weren't standing courageously on the street corner passing out pamphlets, but they were with each other. What shall we do with our teaching now that our master has been challenged in this way? And Peter was there. Now you can easily imagine how a person could have felt so humiliated, so defeated. Even his fall had been predicted and everybody had seen it. That his idea would be to nourish that feeling of ego failure, to allow that humiliation to become his truth. But he didn't. He was there with all of them when Jesus came. And later, when during the 40 days that Jesus continually reappeared, he was walking with Peter on the beach and said to Peter, "Feed my sheep, take care of my people," in other words. And Jesus said, "I will." And Peter said, "I will, Lord." And then after a few moments, Jesus said it again, "Feed my sheep." And Peter said, "Sir, I will." And then the third time, Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And Peter said, "I've told you, sir, I will." But you see, 3 times. But Jesus would not have been able to do that. He would not have been able to, in a very real sense, absolve Peter of his karmic failure if Peter hadn't kept his heart open and put himself where Jesus could. Now this is what we have to understand about all spiritual tests. And the word temptation is used, so we think of temptation as, as infidelity or drug addiction or whatever, anger, revenge, closing our hearts, all sorts of, those are all ways in which we can actively behave badly. But tests are constantly coming to us. Whether we call them that or not, there's just always this moment-by-moment question. How will I respond? Will I deny or will I affirm? Will I embrace my spiritual life or will I seek another avenue? And it's wrong attitude as much as anything. That's our spiritual test. When conditions do not please us. And how often in our lives do conditions not please us? Happens pretty often, doesn't it? You have a job where everything is perfect except, this one person you have to deal with, this one aspect of the job, and this desire all the time to try to just push it away, isn't it? To deny it. This isn't a part of me. I don't have to deal with this. And God keeps putting it back in front of you, doesn't he? Giving you time after time after time to embrace this as my whole reality. But over and over again, whether in large or small ways, and don't imagine that you won't fail also in large ways. It's just part of the story. And I'm always encouraged by stories of great souls who fail miserably. It pleases me enormously. It's not that I'm happy to see them failing, of course not. And again, just referring to all that we went through in our litigation, we were opposed by very great souls, very deeply devoted gurubhais, who did, in my mind, very inappropriate things, thinking that they were good things to do, but I don't think they were good things to do. And some people were quite dismayed to see great souls behaving badly. And even Swami Kriyananda at one point had a really an actual crisis of faith. How can this path be accurate if people who follow it sincerely make errors? And he came up with two answers. One is, he said, every devotee, until he's self-realized, is subject to delusion. And he even said another very interesting aspect about that. He said, when you've reached the top of the mountain, you can casually look around and sort of see how many ways there are up the mountain. And you can be very magnanimous in your acceptance of everyone because your position is secure. Nothing can touch you. But as long as we're in process, as long as we ourselves are climbing up the hill and gripping the little bush and looking for the next place where our fingers can grasp, you see these insane rock climbers who are hanging on, by 1/4 inch. Been there, not on the rock face, but I'm sure all of us know it, where we're just spread-eagled and we just don't know where we're going to go next. And our fingers are gripping and beginning to cramp. And we don't quite know what's going to come next. I mean, it's not a time when you can just have philosophical conversations about all the options, can you? And discuss with other people, whether or not that route is also valid. Every part of you has to concentrate on what it is that we're trying to do. And we have to put ourselves into it and just go forward as best we can and be generous-hearted with ourselves about the fact that we can't do everything at once, can we? Swami's other way of coming free of that was the simple thought, I know what this path means to me. Which is, I know what God has done for me, and it's really not my business as to what he does for anybody else or doesn't do for anybody else. The only way my faith can grow is by my own experience. How many times has God come to me in my hour of need and made the impossible possible? And what more do I need? How many more times does he have to prove himself, and in how many other ways? Now, my attitude toward this has always been different, and this is what I was starting to say. Wow, if even great souls, if even Durga Mata and Dr. Lewis and who knows who, all of them, if all of them at different times can miss the way and turn aside, even when Master is trying to call them. Durga Mata's story of arriving at Mount Washington for the first time and Master preparing a banquet in honor of her return. Which is the tradition in India. When a disciple returns for the first time after many incarnations, there's a celebration. Just thinking of it all as one continuous thing. Master himself was cooking a dinner in honor of Durga Mata, and she felt a little bit unwell. And she had and this was the story that was very briefly told, such a determination that she always had to be useful and could never just let others take care of her. I will not be a burden to anyone, she declares. She ran away from Mount Washington and found out later that Master was very disappointed. He was cooking the banquet for her. And how could she not have felt that? Well, she didn't, did she? So I say, wow, if even great souls can mess up, let's be realistic about what's going to happen to me. Let's be realistic about what it's going to take for me to work through the many, many, many levels of my own delusions. And so when I fail, my friend once did something very careless and caused a great deal of inconvenience for Swami. Not serious harm, but definite inconvenience. And 3 days later, she was very moody still. And Swami finally looked at her and says, "What is wrong with you?" And she said, "Well, I'm so upset because I did so-and-so and it caused you so much trouble." His response was, "What egoism," he said. Not egotism, but egoism, he said. To be egoic is to have a very false sense of yourself. She wasn't egotistical in the terms of thinking how wonderful she was, but she was utterly self-involved. And then he said, "Are you so shocked that you could make an error that 3 days later you're still worshiping it?" Now think about that. He said, "Do you think, is your self-concept such perfection that when you made a slight mistake, you just are so horrified by it that all you can do is just go over and over and over it?" Now, how realistic is that? You see, it's not the errors that we make, it's what we do afterwards. And the humility is everything on the spiritual path. We can be absolutely sincere, but that doesn't mean we're perfect. And unless we can live with that imperfection, we will not either progress or persevere on the spiritual path. It's an odd thing, isn't it? We're always affirming our oneness with Spirit and all the affirmations and all of these things, but you also, on the other side of it, have to be perfectly comfortable with, wow, what a surprise. I have a lot to learn. And also surprisingly, my goodness, those things just ambush us. And just ambush us, and people will say to you, you're behaving a certain way. No, actually, it's your problem, not mine. And they'll say it again, no, actually, that's your problem, not mine. And then 25 years later, you'll say, whoa, it's my problem, not his. What a surprise. And at the same time, you see, not lose heart. And the way we don't lose heart is very simple. God loves us just the way we are. And we're surprised, but He's not. There you have that story about Peter. Who would have thought that Peter, who was so full of confidence and bluster and determination, that he would have been the one? But Jesus knew. And He wasn't also helping Peter. He was helping all of them. Looking at all of them. I know your hearts better than you know your own heart. Many years ago, I got myself into a lot of mental conundrum, which I was very inclined to do, and was just not functioning very well or very attuned. And Swami came up to me and he said, how are you? In this very sensitive way, how are you? And there was something about his tone of voice. I said, I don't know, how am I? Just like that. And he said, I'm worried about you. I am too. I didn't know that I was until he said that to me. Fortunately, in that moment, I didn't shine him on. I'm worried about you. Yes, I'm worried about me too. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And I don't just mean Swami Kriyananda standing in front of you asking you a question. I mean God, Divine Mother, the Gurus, your guardian angel. They know us much better than we know ourselves. And they're not surprised. And they're certainly not upset. In fact, that's often the moment they say, well, now we can get to work. Yes, you really have made a hash of it, haven't you? What a just colossal, really cosmically impressive mess you've made of things. Because we have, and we do, just after devotion, which is the first thing you need on the spiritual path. The second is a sense of humor. And above all, we need a sense of humor about ourselves. And I'm not saying that lightly. To be able, there's that, a T-shirt that Swami used to wear sometimes that said, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. He used it for pajamas. He never wore it out on the street. It was so absurd. You would see Swami, even in his pajamas, you would see this enormous consciousness wearing a little label of some sort, and it would just be completely incongruous. People do this all very casually now, but it's not a good idea. But that one he could wear pretty nicely. But taking yourself lightly, that doesn't mean you don't take yourself seriously. Because our spiritual salvation is the only thing there is. And how we're doing in our consciousness is the only criteria ever worth considering. But we also have to take it lightly. I'm a project. I am God's project. I'm Guru's project. And He's going to stay with me until the picture is finished. And in the meantime, we're going to have some impressive boo-boos along the way. Think of it as a movie script. And it's not always easy. I mean, whoever tells you it's easy is not telling you the truth. But it's worth doing. And the alternatives are infinitely worse, that I promise you. We face these tests, we just face them. And part of the last point I want to make, part of what makes it not so difficult is just the realization, let me think how to put this exactly. These things happen. That's the right word. These things happen. These things happen to me. These things happen to great souls. Other people repay karmic debts that I don't particularly want to have repaid. They do things that you might not have asked for. You respond in ways that you're mortified to see are possible within you. But, well, these things happen. And the best way to pass our tests, really, the most important thing is don't have a complex about them. You know, I have observed that we suffer, everybody suffers. But when you're not suffering, you're not suffering. When you are suffering, it's not fun, but you are, and there you are. These things happen. But when it's over, let it go. What people do is they make a complex out of their suffering. Oh, how could I? Oh, how could they? They either make themselves victims or they spend all their time being afraid it's going to happen again. Trust me, it's going to happen again. Yeah. And your fear about it's just going to spoil the time in between. Don't bother. Because wherever God puts you and wherever God sends you, that's exactly where you need to be. And that's the answer to all of it. Swamiji wrote in a Christmas message about a decade ago, he said, I've always had a desire, to escape the material plane of consciousness, he said. The astral world has always been more real to me, he said, in many places than this world. He said, but increasingly, I've begun to appreciate that heaven is wherever God puts you. Because if God put you there and gave you those circumstances, what other definition of heaven could there be? No matter how miserable, no matter how challenging, if the divine has put you there, it's because that's perfect for you. And what else would we want except what God wants for us? Is that easy? No. Is it worth doing? Yes. And let us all help one another. Because by our accepting attitude of our own failings and of the failings of others, then we do our little part to make the place where God has put us heaven on earth. God bless you.